Nobody had it circled on their calendar. Nobody had it flagged as a match worth watching. A wild card against a top 15 seed on red clay? The math was simple, the result was obvious, and the tennis world had already moved on before the first ball was even struck. And then Alexandra Eala walked out onto the Manolo Santana Stadium court and proceeded to make every single one of those assumptions look embarrassing. There's a version of this story that gets told a lot. Young player, big occasion, nerves take over, experienced opponent wins comfortably, everyone nods and says they saw it coming. And for the first part of this match, that version looked like it was writing itself perfectly. Eala was 20 years old, born in Manila, handed a wild card into the draw with a serve that analysts had been publicly questioning for the better part of 2 seasons. Bencic was ranked 11 in the world, playing some of the best tennis of her career, and standing on the exact surface where her particular style of game causes the most damage. The setup could not have been more tilted in one direction, which is precisely what made what happened next so extraordinary. Before we get into the match itself, you have to understand who Belinda Bencic actually is in 2026, because this is not the same player who left the tour in early 2024. When Bencic announced her pregnancy and stepped away from the game, she was ranked inside the top 10. She gave birth to her daughter Bella, spent 6 months away from professional tennis, and returned to a ranking of 421st in the world. The climb back was not handed to her. Every single point, every single win, every single ranking position was rebuilt from scratch through matches that nobody was watching and courts that nobody was writing about. By the time the Madrid draw was announced, she was back inside the top 12, carrying one of the stronger records on tour through the early part of the season and arriving off a deep run at Indian Wells. What made Bencic so dangerous on these courts specifically was not just form, it was style. Madrid sits at altitude. The air is thinner. The ball travels faster through it, and topspin, which usually drags shots down into the court, loses a significant chunk of its effectiveness. For a player like Bencic, who prefers to stand close to the baseline, absorb pace early, and redirect rather than generate her own power, those conditions are essentially a gift. She doesn't need the heavy spin game that other clay court specialists rely on. She just needs pace coming at her and time to redirect it. Madrid gives her both in abundance. She arrived as the favorite not because of reputation alone, but because the conditions were built for exactly the tennis she plays best. Eala arrived carrying none of those advantages and several significant liabilities. Her clay season in 2026 had produced 1 win against 2 losses before this match began. The loss to Andreescu in Stuttgart had been one-sided enough to raise genuine questions about her readiness for the surface. Her serve, which has been the most discussed and most criticized element of her game since she turned professional, was still producing numbers that would make any coaching staff uncomfortable. First, serve percentages below 60, double fault counts climbing across multiple matches, a ball toss that drifts under pressure, and a second delivery that sits up invitingly for any opponent willing to take it on. On clay, where rallies are longer and every weak second serve gets punished more severely than on any other surface, these were not small problems. They were structural ones. The opening set confirmed everything the statistics suggested. Eala's serve broke down almost immediately, 3 double faults inside the first 4 games. A break surrendered on a serve that clipped the tape and died, and an overall level of play that gave Bencic absolutely nothing to worry about. The Swiss player moved through that set at a comfortable pace, never pressured, the kind of win that feels inevitable while it's happening and gets forgotten about 10 minutes after it's over. But here is the thing about winning a set, that way there is a trap buried inside it. When your opponent is essentially defeating themselves, you don't actually have to establish your own game. You don't have to impose your preferred court position or find your best rhythms under pressure. You just have to stay out of the way and let the mistakes accumulate. Bencic won that first set without ever really having to play Bencic tennis. Her positioning through those 9 games sat deeper than her natural preference. She was reactive rather than proactive, and that meant that when Eala finally stopped making errors and started making decisions, Bencic had no established foundation to fall back on. She had been winning on borrowed time without knowing it. The second set opened, with Eala doing something she had almost never done consistently on clay. In 2026, she started taking the return of serve away from Bencic entirely. Not waiting, not defending, attacking. 2 full steps inside the baseline, weight forward, picking the ball up early off the bounce and driving it back with pace and direction before Bencic had any time to set up for the rally. The target was always the same: deep to the backhand, deep to the backhand, deep to the backhand, over and over, game after game, until the pattern started producing cracks. The reason this worked so specifically against Bencic requires understanding how her backhand actually functions under pressure. It is her more consistent side, reliable, technically sound, rarely a source of errors on neutral balls. But it is not her attacking wing. When she gets pushed deep and wide to that corner, particularly by a ball arriving with pace rather than heavy topspin, her default response is to redirect cross-court and reset the rally rather than go for a winner. Against most opponents, that conservative choice is perfectly fine because the next ball is not going to hurt you. Against a left-handed player already standing inside the court and hunting aggressively, that conservative cross-court ball becomes the setup for the next attack. The geometry of left-handed returning creates angles that right-handed players are simply not trained to defend against with the same regularity. Rally after rally, Bencic found herself a fraction further out of position than she wanted to be, and the pressure began compounding in ways that are difficult to manage once they start. Eala has spent years training at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca. She arrived there at 13 years old and has built the foundation of her entire professional game around its philosophy. Nadal's career was constructed on a single foundational belief that the return of serve should not be a defensive act. It should be the beginning of the attack. That the server's supposed moment of maximum control could be converted, with the right positioning and the right mindset, into their moment of maximum vulnerability. Eala has absorbed that philosophy at the deepest possible level. It is not a tactic she applies occasionally. It is the architecture her game is built on. The breakpoint arrived in the fifth game of the second set. Bencic served. Eala came forward and drove a heavy return into the backhand corner. Bencic pushed a safe cross-court reply and suddenly found Eala already inside the court, stepping around the ball and absolutely crushing a forehand inside-out winner that landed right on the baseline. The crowd reacted, and more importantly, Bencic reacted. You could see it happen in real time. The extra bounces before the next serve, the glance toward the coaching box, the slight tightening in the shoulders that signals a player reaching for more rather than trusting their process. She started trying to hit through the problem with pace rather than solve it with placement. That particular mental shift from playing tennis to fighting tennis is exactly the state of mind Eala's game is designed to create. The double faults started arriving almost immediately after it. 2 of them in the 7th game alone. The second set ended 6-4, and the entire match suddenly had a completely different energy running through it. The third set was not pretty. Let's be honest about that up front. This was not a set of tennis defined by clean ball striking or tactical elegance. Both players were struggling to hold serve. Both were making errors at rates that would have been unacceptable under normal circumstances. And the scoreboard moved in ways that felt almost random. Eala broke. Bencic broke back within the next game. Eala broke again. Bencic broke back again. 4 breaks of serve in the first 6 games, and neither player seemed capable of stringing together 2 solid service games in a row. Eala's first serve percentage dropped to 51%. Bencic's sat at 54%. The match had essentially become a contest about who could manage imperfection more effectively under the weight of everything that was riding on the result. That weight was real, and it was different for each of them. For Bencic, this match was about protecting the momentum of a comeback season that had been building steadily since January. Losing to an unseeded wildcard on clay would not erase that progress, but it would introduce a question mark where previously there had been none about whether the consistency was real, about whether the ranking was earned, about whether a player who had been away from the tour for 6 months could actually compete at the highest level when the opponent refused to cooperate. For Eala, the stakes were different but equally significant. Clay had been the surface where her limitations were most visible and most discussed. A win here, against this opponent, in these circumstances, would fundamentally shift the conversation about what she was capable of and what her ceiling actually looked like. What gave Eala an edge in that chaotic third set had nothing to do with any statistic. It had to do with familiarity. She had played these courts before. She knew the particular pace of this clay slightly faster than Roland Garros, with a skid on the ball that punishes late positioning more severely than almost any other clay surface on the calendar. She knew the wind patterns inside the Caja Magica, the way the open roof creates unpredictable gusts that shift direction without warning during afternoon matches. She knew how the light changed as evening approached and the long shadows crept in from the western side of the stadium. None of this made Madrid comfortable for her. But discomfort that you recognize is fundamentally different from discomfort that is new. In a match where both players were fighting their own games, that familiarity with the specific texture of the challenge was worth something that will never appear on any stat sheet. The ninth game was where everything came to a point. Bencic was serving at 4-5 in the third set, trying to hold and force Eala to serve out the match under maximum pressure. She fought through it as well as anyone could have asked, absorbing pressure, defending breakpoints, and producing the fastest serve of the entire match at 172 kilometers per hour to hold off one critical moment. And then the double fault came, match point. Eala stepped forward, chipped a low return that stayed below knee height off the bounce, and watched Bencic reach down and push a forehand wide into the tram lines. The point was over before the crowd had finished processing what had just happened. And then Alex dropped, both knees hitting the clay simultaneously, both hands pressing flat into the red dirt, tears running down her face, while the entire stadium rose around her. 2 hours and 27 minutes of tennis had brought her to this moment, a 20-year-old wildcard from Manila who had been written off before the first point was played. On the surface that had exposed her most publicly, against a player who had every reason to win. She had absorbed a first set that went against her completely. She had found something in herself in the second that changed the entire match. She had survived a third set that threatened to collapse everything she had built. And she had come through. That image, Eala on her knees in the Madrid clay, palms pressed into the dirt, tears coming down. A stadium of people who had underestimated her 2 hours earlier, now giving her a standing ovation, is the reason tennis still produces moments that no other sport can replicate. It's what happens when someone refuses to accept the story that everyone else has already written for them. Whatever comes next in Alexandra Eala's career, whatever surfaces challenge her or serve percentages haunt her, this match will always be the one that proved the story was never finished. It was just getting started. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment hit you hardest. And if you want breakdowns like this every week through the clay season, subscribe now, because this tournament is just warming up.